I'm going to walk through here the process that I use to sort of dig out some application questions for the worship guide each week. And so we'll start off here, look at the passage for this week. This week we're looking at 1 Samuel 25. And the first thing that you want to do is kind of remember what has happened to this point. So if we think through the book of 1 Samuel, we have the story of Samuel's birth at the beginning, story of Eli, story of God calling Samuel, and then we get into the people demanding a king, and so God finally grants them a king after telling them what a king is going to do to them, how he's going to take advantage of them, but they still demand a king, so Samuel anoints Saul as king over Israel. And we read about Saul and his successes for a while, and then there's around chapters 15 through 20, we start to see how Saul is not listening to the command of Yahweh, how Saul is not doing what he's supposed to be doing as king. And in that moment when Saul is abandoning his responsibility as the king over Israel, Yahweh lets Saul know that this is not acceptable, that the king of Israel will not be a king who ignores Yahweh. Saul is not there for his own sake. Saul is there to serve Yahweh and to serve Israel. And if he's not going to do that, then the Lord is going to remove his spirit from Saul. He's going to replace Saul with another king. And so we read the story of God choosing David, Samuel anointing David. And after a while, Saul begins to realize what's going on with David, that David will replace him. And so Saul turns against David. And at this point in the story, where we've been reading about how Saul has been pursuing David and trying to kill him, and how David has repeatedly escaped Saul's grasp, how he's been rescued over and over again. And last week we read chapter 24, where David has an opportunity to kill Saul. Saul gets so close to David that he actually finds the cave that David's in. He doesn't realize David is there. And while Saul is in the cave, David sneaks up on him, cuts off a piece of his robe, and then as Saul is leaving, David calls out to him and shows Saul how close he was, how he had the opportunity to take his life, and he didn't. And it's at that point that Saul acknowledges that David is righteous and Saul is not. And so this is where we're at. We just got through that section in chapter 24, where Saul says, "You are more righteous than I, for you've repaid me good, whereas I've repaid you evil. And you have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, and that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you've done to me this day. And now behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house." And David swore this to Saul. And then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. So Saul finally comes to terms with the fact that David is going to replace him. He sort of accepts that here. And in a last-ditch effort to preserve himself, Saul makes David swear an oath to him that David is not going to not only kill Saul, but will not erase his memory, his legacy, that he won't hurt his offspring, that sort of a thing. So now, after this episode, chapter 25 begins with the note that Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. Okay, so now we're going to read the story of David and Abigail. And what I will do as I read through this is I'll kind of highlight things that stick out at me as either unusual or interesting or perhaps important. But in this first read through, basically what I'm trying to do is get a feel for what is this chapter about? What is the main point here? Could I summarize this in one or two sentences? So as I'm reading through here, I'm trying to pay attention to what is going on in this story. So at the end of it, hopefully, if someone asks, what is chapter 25 about, I can give a concise answer to that. And then what does chapter 25 say about whatever it's about? And that's sort of the building block from which we'll dig into application questions. So I'll read through here and kind of highlight things that I think are important, and then think through what are the principles here and how do we apply them today. So let's look at these highlights here and kind of discuss why I think they're interesting. This first one here starts off the story, points out that this man, Nabal, he was very rich. So the first thing that we know about him, one of the first things, is that he has the means to be generous. All right, then we learn about his wife, Abigail. She was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. So the narrator's setting up a contrast between Nabal and his wife Abigail, in a sense, pointing out that she's too good for him, I guess. Now here, there's mention that Nabal is a Calebite. I'm sure that it's mentioned for a reason. It's probably worth digging into the Calebites, seeing what Scripture says about them. Maybe finding out why this is mentioned explicitly. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. So David and Nabal both know that this is a day for feasting. David is just asking for Nabal to provide something for the men that have watched out for Nabal's shepherds. Nabal basically responds that, hey, I have no idea who you are. This idea, who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? You'll remember when David was introduced, he was the idea of him as the son of Jesse came up a lot, and David's name, there was a lot of hesitation in the narrative about mentioning him specifically until he's finally mentioned. So this kind of harkens back to the beginning of the David narrative. Who is David again, and his association with his father? He is the son of Jesse. So I'm not sure exactly how this plays into the narrative here, but it's just something that I noticed that reminds me of the early part of the story of David. And then what Nabal says here is very interesting. He says, there are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. It's almost like Nabal is on Saul's side. Nabal knows that David is opposed to Saul. But whereas we just saw David honor Saul by not taking his life, Nabal is treating David like he is an enemy. And so I think that's interesting. When Nabal refuses to provide for him, David retaliates. All right. Abigail, Nabal's wife, steps in for Nabal. It'd be interesting to ask, what is her motivation for this, because she clearly has contempt for the man. Is it just loyalty to him as his wife? This is her obligation. What else is motivating here? Is she afraid that David is going to slaughter her as well, which is a reasonable fear, because David later will say, Yeah. As surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has restrained me from hurting you. So that could be the motivation here is she knows that she's in trouble if she doesn't do something. But she frankly says that her husband is a worthless man. So she's not honoring him, that's for sure. She's acknowledging the reality that he's not a good husband, that he's not a good man anyways. All right, then we see here, God, do so to the enemies of David, and also more, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to Nabal. This is David speaking. Let me think about what he's saying here. What is he saying? God, do so to the enemies of David, and more also. Do what to the enemies of David? Is it not leave so much as one male of all who belong to him? Is it do what to the enemies of David? Maybe it's return evil. No, because he would be saying something good. He's wishing something good on his own enemies if he fails to do what he says he's going to do. So I need to think more about what he's actually saying here. Here, Abigail meets David, and she says, "On me alone, my lord, be the guilt." So she's actually standing in for her husband. She's taking the guilt on herself off of her husband. Once again, she refers to him as worthless. That goes with what she said up here. And then she points out that Yahweh has kept David from blood guilt, which is true because had David, this would be murder. David is planning a murder here. This is not justified. A lot of times when we think of David as the model king of Israel, we ignore a lot of the wrong things. Of course, it's well known, and we often point to David's sin with Bathsheba, but there's a lot more to David than what we think of. It seems pretty clear in the narrative that this action he was going to do, where he was going to take revenge, that is unjustified, and he is planning not just murder, but leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. I mean, this is why? Because he didn't give them bread and water. So I think it's important to pick up on the sin that David intends to commit here. So she says, "The Lord has restrained you from blood guilt, and the Lord has restrained you from saving with your own hand." The Lord has restrained you from rescuing yourself. It's strange that it's saving. Let's see what this footnote says here. Yeah, these are just cross references. Saving with your own hand. This is the common, in Hebrew, this is the common word for rescue, deliver, kept you from saving with your own hand. Who is he who is he rescuing? He's not rescuing himself, which is what this is saying, because rescuing from what? He's taking vengeance, and vengeance isn't the same as deliverance, so it's a little confusing what this means here. She basically curses David's enemies. She blesses David. She acknowledges that Yahweh has spoken about David and appointed him. Let's see what this footnote says. Yeah, the word here for prince is not the normal word for prince. Oh, this is the wrong... This isn't the word that pops up on the bottom. This is not the word I think it is. Let's take a little bit of a look at what this word means. So here the word is nagid. And it says it's a leader called in at a time of need, or the one declared to lead. Chief leader or prince. You see here, this is the normal word. This is the word sar. This is the word that usually gets translated as prince in English. And it doesn't, what's important to realize here is the word prince in English today has connotations of like the son of the king. That's not what this word means. This word does not mean son of the king. This word means an official in a capacity, but he's not as high of a rank as the king. So he is a ruler over Israel, but it's not the word for king. Is interesting because, David has been anointed, but David also recognized Saul as the Lord's anointed. So this is interesting that she doesn't say he is appointed king over Israel. Once again, shed blood without cause, without just cause. The cause for shedding blood was Nabal's attitude toward David, but that does not justify shedding his blood. And again, for David working salvation himself. It's worth digging into this to find out what exactly is intended there. And then, of course, she asks to be remembered by David kindly for what she is offering to him when, inevitably, as she says, she's blessing David. And when these blessings come true, she wants David to remember her kindly. And, of course, David responds favorably. He acknowledges, blessed be, so he blesses Abigail, and acknowledges that she has kept him from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. It's almost as if Abigail knows that she is stepping in for David, stepping in to stop David. Abigail portrays that stepping in as Yahweh stepping in, almost as if to say that Yahweh is the one behind my actions here. Yahweh is stepping in, but he's doing it through me. And David recognizes that it is Abigail who keeps him from blood guilt, from working salvation with his own hand. So David is affirming that Abigail is the one who is doing the work of Yahweh here. He sees her as Yahweh's agent. All right, and so here we go back to Nabal after David grants her peace, blesses her, and gives her what she asks for, concedes to her. Abigail comes home to Nabal, and David said this is a feast day, and Nabal has clearly prepared for a feast because he's holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king. I mean, that's interesting terminology here. This is the word for king, the regular word for king. The only king in this story is Nabal. Saul isn't called king. He's called master, if this is a reference, Lord, Adon. David isn't referred to as a king. He's referred to as a prince. The only one who gets called a king in this story is Nabal. I think that's interesting. And it's sarcastically, obviously. So Abigail waits until morning to explain to Nabal what has happened. His heart dies within him, which is really interesting wording as well. I would not take this as him having a heart attack, especially since the Lord struck him happens later. But this word for heart, we've talked about before, heart, this is just the idea of the inward person. So this doesn't necessarily mean your anatomical heart. This doesn't necessarily mean the emotional part of you or the compassionate part of you as opposed to the rational part of you. The word here for heart, the word lev or levav, this just means your inner person. So this would be your mind, your emotions, your will, all of that is implied by heart. And he became as stone. I feel like there's probably a play on words here or something. I mean, this is a very figurative description. And so my guess is that there's a little bit more under the surface here. But then 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal and he died. Okay. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord who has avenged the insult I received." Now it's interesting that it is unjust for David to kill Nabal over the insult or over the rejection. That would be wrong for David to do. He would be guilty of murder there. But it's not wrong for Yahweh to kill him for that reason, apparently. I mean, there's no reason not to associate the Lord striking him with what he has done to David. I mean, you could say, it was a coincidence. The Lord struck him for another reason, but there's no indication in this story that we should not associate those two. Especially when David connects those two, when he hears that Nabal is dead, he says, "Blessed be the Lord who has avenged the insult I've received." And the Lord kept back his servant, that means me, David, from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head. And so we have to have a very broad definition of evil here, because the evil of Nabal was not being hospitable. And this is probably a little hard for us to understand in our culture, but David sees the death of Nabal as returning the evil of Nabal on his own head. So David is almost saying, this is too much, but the story almost puts the evil of inhospitality as deserving of death. That's a very serious, to say that not being hospitable is worthy of death. Now you could say, well, he was being inhospitable to the Lord's anointed, or, he was being inhospitable to people who may have died had they not gotten the help that Abigail gave them. So you could stretch that to say that him being inhospitable was almost like killing them. But that may have been how inhospitability in this culture was perceived in general. Obviously, it is much easier for us to survive on our own in our culture, in our society today, than it was for them. David is not at his home. David is not where he's able to provide for himself, so he's depending on the generosity of someone else. And that person rejects him. And this whole narrative seems to imply that that rejection of David to provide food for him was deserving of death and almost equal to death, because the Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head. It's basically equating inhospitality with death. That's what it seems like anyways. Then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. This is really interesting, at least from our perspective. There's a lot that could be said about this. Why is David taking Abigail as his wife? Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Why is he taking his enemy's wife? Now, his enemy is dead. She's no longer bound to Nabal. What's going on here? I think there's a couple things to think about. First, this could be David's way of providing for Abigail now that her husband's gone. This could be a way of blessing Abigail by accepting her, by taking her in, providing for her. That would make more sense once David is king, because right now he's sort of on the run constantly and he's always in danger. And so I'm not sure how helpful it is right now to Abigail for David to take her as his wife. But maybe this is a recognition of the faith that Abigail has in David as Yahweh's appointed prince, that David is saying, look, you have this much faith that I'm going to be successful, that the Lord is with me. Come with me. And when the Lord grants me all that he has promised, you will also, as she asks him, when the Lord has dealt well, when Yahweh has dealt well with my Lord, remember your servant. So, in one sense, David is answering Abigail's own request. He remembers her. Now, he doesn't remember her by sending her everything that she would need. I mean, David himself doesn't yet have everything that she would need. So it's not a slam dunk to say that this is David providing for Abigail, because David's not yet in a position to provide for her securely. He's not the king yet. Another thing, which I think is actually maybe even more interesting that David is doing here, consider this in the context. The story before this, we had Saul ask David to swear an oath that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house. And David swears that he will not do these things to Saul. Nabal, now that he's dead, it doesn't say anything in this story about whether him and Abigail have children. Now that he's dead, he obviously can't have any more children. His wife is taken into David to be David's wife. This may be a way of insulting Nabal in his death, of disgracing him, dishonoring him. It may be. I'd have to look into this a little bit more. One of the resources that I have over here, the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary, is really good at pointing out these cultural things and sort of suggesting what's hard for us to see. So I'll look through here and see if it says anything about that, but that's interesting. So he takes her as his wife, and then she accepts. She rose, bowed with her face to the ground, and said, behold, your handmaid is a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. So she's responding to these servants basically by serving them. She hurried and rose, mounted a donkey. Her and her 5 young women attended her. She followed the messengers of David and became his wife. And then there's this note at the end of the chapter. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel. That's a location in Israel. And both of them became his wives. So both Ahinoam and Abigail become David's wives. Saul had given Michal, his daughter, who was David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was of Galim. I need to refresh my memory on this because it sounds like Saul had given Michal to David to be his wife. I don't know if that's just betrothing her to him or if they were actually husband and wife now. But now it's saying Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish. So Saul takes David's wife away from him and gives her to another man. That's something I need to look into a little bit more as well. So anyways, this is what I found interesting about the chapter. Now we ask the question, what is chapter 25 about? Chapter 25, and you want to have as all-encompassing of a statement as possible. You can't have a 44 verse statement here to answer that question. But what is the main point of this story? What, in other words, what is the basic message of 1 Samuel 25? How would you describe the basic message of 1 Samuel 25 to someone else? If someone asks me, what's the basic message of 1 Samuel 25? What is the author trying to communicate to us in this chapter? The basic thing that he's trying to communicate in the context of 1 Samuel, because you could say he's trying to tell us a story about Abigail here. And this story is just as much about Abigail as it is about David. But in the context of 1 Samuel, if we assume that David is the primary character in this section, if not Yahweh, then what does this story tell us? How is this story more about David than Abigail? Well, Abigail is a character here that's Yahweh's agent. So this is still a story about Yahweh providing for, taking care of, protecting, guarding, preventing David from sin, or at least from transgression. So in that sense, this story is about Yahweh stepping in to stop David from making a mistake. And he does that through Abigail. The character of Nabal just sets that up, sets up the opportunity for David to make a mistake. But the story here is about how God prevents David from making that mistake. And he does that through the character of Abigail. Why do you think this passage was written? What did the author hope to accomplish in the minds and hearts of the readers? So I think what he hopes to accomplish for the reader is he wants the reader to see Yahweh's sovereignty. He wants the reader to know Yahweh is sovereign. I think he also wants the reader to know that David has his blemishes, whatever, has his sin, but Yahweh is still working for and through David. Yahweh is faithful to David. And the author wants the reader to know that. God is blessing David. God is protecting David, providing for David. He is faithful to David. And David, in the end, just like the section above, David corrects Saul, and Saul acknowledges his sin. Here, Abigail corrects David, and David acknowledges his sin, or what he intended to do was wrong, that he was in the wrong. So it's interesting how you have chapter 24, David is in the right, Saul is in the wrong. Chapter 25, clearly Nabal is in the wrong, but David now also is in the wrong. But in chapter 24, where Yahweh prevented Saul from killing David, and here, the language in 24, David's heart struck him. In 25, when Nabal realizes what he had done, his heart dies within him. So that's an interesting parallel. So this story is about, I think, Yahweh's continued faithfulness to David, specifically by Yahweh preventing David from transgression, from guilt, and by avenging David, so David doesn't have to do it. David would not be in the right for taking vengeance. It would be wrong for him to do that. And so I think that one of the principles that we can apply to ourselves today, now this is still a principle, this isn't application yet, but if we say, one of the reasons why we don't take vengeance for ourselves, it's not just because God says, vengeance is mine. One of the reasons we don't take vengeance for ourselves is because we're not innocent. And were we to take vengeance, we would be guilty. So we need someone who's innocent. We need someone who is just and righteous to do the vengeance taking on our behalf. We have no right to take vengeance. Now, what's the difference between vengeance and justice? Don't we have the right to take justice? Again, taking justice for yourself is something that the New Testament speaks about. You think of the Sermon on the Mount and all the different ways that Jesus teaches not to take justice into your own hands. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the left as well. If someone steals from you, don't demand it back. All these ways that we're not to take justice for ourselves. But don't we have an obligation of justice towards others? How does this work out? If we see injustice, what's our responsibility? It's clearly our responsibility to name it, to point it out, to identify it. But do we have any responsibility in upholding justice or making things right? If not for our own benefit, for the benefit of those around us. I think that that's something to think through carefully. So I think we do have I think it makes sense that we have a responsibility as humans. Humans have a responsibility to uphold justice. Now, we could talk about the distinction between humans who are the church, or humans as the church, and humans as the state, because the state clearly seems to be described as given the authority by God for justice. So, if we're not part of the state, do we have a right to take justice into our own hands? Things to think about here. But I think a principle that can apply to us is that we need someone to take vengeance. Now we're talking about vengeance, not justice. We need someone to take vengeance for us. We have no right to take vengeance for ourselves because we are not innocent, and we would certainly be guilty if we were to take vengeance. I think that's a true principle that works its way out in this text and is still a universal enough principle to be true for us. But that's just the principle. How do we apply that principle? Well, what are some ways that we are treated unjustly? Just think through some ways that you personally have experienced injustice, that you personally have been treated unfairly, unjustly. What are some ways that you've experienced that? And then think about taking vengeance for that. The evil that someone does to you, you yourself putting it back on them. That's what David wanted to do here. But had David done that, he would have been guilty. I don't think that had David done that, he would have been guilty. Therefore, for that reason, if we do that, we're guilty. I'm not saying because David would have been guilty, we also would be guilty. But I do think it's true that we would be guilty for doing it, just as it's true that David would be guilty for doing it. I'm not saying that the fact that David would be guilty makes it wrong for us. I think there's another reason why it's wrong for David and why it's wrong for us. I'm not trying to take the principle that David would have been guilty, therefore we are also guilty. But I think there's a higher level principle, a more universal principle that applies in both cases. So, when we experience injustice, how should we respond? That's something to think about. That's the application we need to think about. How should we respond? How should David have responded here? It's easy to say, just take it. Is that the right answer? Is that what David should have done? The text here doesn't tell us what David really should have done. It tells us what he should not have done, how God stopped him from doing it. And since the text here doesn't tell us how we should respond to injustice, we can't really find our answer in this passage. But it prompts an interesting question, and we can go elsewhere in Scripture to find an answer to that. So that's one application question that I would throw out there. How are we supposed to respond when people act unjustly toward us, act wickedly towards us? That's one question. Another question. Another principle in this text. It's hard to abstract this from all the details because it's not clear what Abigail's motivation was. It seems very probable that she's acting out of self-interest and self-preservation because she knows she's going to suffer whatever Nabal suffers. That seems pretty clear in the text. So it's not like she's a detached bystander. It's not like we can draw out of this text the principle of, whenever we see injustice going on around us, we need to make it right ourselves. She doesn't do anything to Nabal, but what she does is she performs the righteous act that Nabal should have done. That's really that's really interesting too. Okay, so is that a principle that we can rightly transfer from this text into our lives today? She doesn't take vengeance. She doesn't punish Nabal for his wickedness. She leaves that to Yahweh. But what she does do is she does the right thing that Nabal should have done. So she picks up the slack of righteousness. She picks up the slack of justice. I think this helps us answer what are we supposed to do when we see injustice, because we know that we have cautions, let's just say it that way. Again, I think of the Sermon on the Mount. We have cautions against seeking to vindicate ourselves or seeking to demand justice. Now, Abigail isn't presented. We could argue that she is sinned against in here because her life is put in danger by Nabal. So in that sense, he sins against her. But this story isn't presenting Abigail as the victim. Abigail is the witness to injustice. And again, I don't want to pretend like this is altruistic. She has a motivation for what she's doing, but the fact is the way she responds to this injustice is not by bringing David the head of her husband. The way that she responds to this injustice is by picking up Nabal's slack, by doing the righteous deed that he should have done. I think there's something there for us to apply to ourselves today. So when we see injustice around us, it's not necessarily our place to punish the wicked, to punish the evildoer, to punish the unrighteous. But we do have an opportunity to fill the gap of righteousness that someone else has created, to fill the void of righteousness that someone else has created, to do the righteous deed that someone else left undone. So, the application question for that principle, because again, that's just a principle. How do we apply it? Here's a question that'll help us think through how to apply that. What gap in righteousness, what privation of righteousness, what privation of justice do you see around you today? Like, can you think of an instance of someone not treated rightly? What can you do for that person who is mistreated? Not what can you do to the unrighteous person, but what can you do for the victim of that unrighteousness? What can you do for them? So think about that. Those are the questions that I'm going to put into this week's reflection guide. First, I have to remember what the first question was. I think we were talking about what is our obligation. I'll have to go back and watch this now to remember what the first question was. But the second question being, what gap in righteousness do you see around you? I'll have to find a better way to word that. But what void, what is missing? What injustice do you see? And don't ask yourself, what can I do to the wicked person, the unrighteous person? Ask yourself, what can I do for the victim? All right, so that's what I'm going to do as far as the questions go this week. That's kind of my approach here. That's how I think through these things. So hopefully that's helpful as you sort of think through the text yourself on your own. if there's anything you can use for sort of a process of how to think about the text, I hope that's helpful.